Welcome. Good evening. Welcome to our May Great Presenters program at the Wayland Library. Tonight we are excited to have Marla Greenfield here to talk to us about the transparency of watercolors letting layers shine through. Marla became a full-time watercolor artist in 1998 after retiring from a 15-year career in the investment business. She's drawn to watercolors because of their transparency and luminosity. Painting things she finds beautiful, peaceful, and calming, she strives primarily to depict the beauty of light in her art. She's a signature member of the American Watercolor Society and a past president and signature member of the New England Watercolor Society, where she also served as a member on the board. She's exhibited in shows throughout the country, won numerous awards, and has been featured in a number of national publications. She teaches watercolor classes and workshops. Her work is currently on display at the Noah Gallery in Groton, Artisan's Way in Concord, and the Florentine Gallery in Weston. It can also be viewed on her website, marlagreenfield.com. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Just a couple of housekeeping notes, as usual. We are recording this session for broadcast on Waycam, our local cable access channel, and for the library's YouTube webpage, so you'll be able to rewatch and share. And Marla welcomes questions at any time, so raise your hand. If you're on Zoom, put your question in the chat, and I will raise my hand for you. And now it's time for Marla. Thank you.
So I can take this off while I talk? Yeah. Okay. It's hard to talk with that on. So I'm going to start by asking how many people are watercolorists or have painted with watercolor before? Okay. So I'm going to go through a little bit of how I start. The thing that I like about watercolors is that they are transparent for the most part, depending on which paint you use, but I like to use the transparent colors because everything you do underneath shows through, and when you layer on top of what you've already done, it has a really, really nice effect. So what I'd like to do is show you how I start and then maybe do some layering over. I'm not going to paint a whole painting, but you can tell by my work, we'd be here for a number of hours if I were to try to finish a painting. So all of the work that I do is from my own references, and what I do is either set things up or come upon things if it's a scene. I blow them up to make larger copies. I'm just going to show you what I do. So this is the reference that I'm going to be working on right now. It's similar to that painting. That's why I brought it in. And I have these blown up so I can see what's going on. And I also do two other things. I make a lighter version of it because the camera doesn't see the same depth that your eyes see. So if your darks are the right dark, your whites are washed out. And if your lights are proper, you can't really see what's going on in the dark areas. So I end up working from both of these. And then I do a little thing with Adobe Photoshop where I call this my value sketch. It just kind of helps me see where the darks are a little bit more than just the photograph does. So it's sort of a little cheat sheet for me. So the way I start is I start with primary colors underneath, and then I layer over what's called local color, which is sort of the color that you see, and in the finished painting. So I'm going to put some paint out here. I'm using primaries blue, yellow, and red, and the reason why I don't paint with anything but primaries is because once you go over a color that has been mixed, what's called a tertiary color, you can get kind of mud. But if you're using primaries, you get a much clearer color once over it. So I'm starting with red and yellow and blue, and I don't know if it makes sense if people want to come forward, or you're welcome to come closer, or I don't know if you'll be able to see what I'm doing on the screen. Okay. All right. So what I'm thinking about when I'm doing an underpainting is I'm thinking not so much about red, yellow, and blue. I'm thinking more about warm, cool, and glow, which is yellow. And I'm going to start with a shadow shape. And so let's make this clean. So I'm going to wet the whole area, only the area that I want to put paint on. And this is what I like about watercolors is that, my stuff is not very loose per se, but in the areas that I'm painting, I let the paint do what it does, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So you can see in some of these shadows, there are cool and warm areas. I don't know if you can see, there's sort of a glow here. This is cool on the edge. See how warm this is underneath the grape. A lot of that is reflected color of the object that's around it. So I'm going to use some of these colors that I see in the shadow, or the warmth and cool that I see in the shadow. I'm going to flip this over so I'm looking at it. So the paint's going to stay in the wet area.
What kind of paper are you using?
I'm using 300 pound, and it's called Arches Cold Press. I usually use the cold press, and I like the 300 pound because I put a lot of water on it, and it holds up, it doesn't buckle. So you can see I'm moving the paint around, and it's kind of combining on the paper. And this is what watercolor does really well, and I think it's really very pretty when you see what happens to it. It sort of granulates, and it's almost like there's too much water on the paper to get it to move. And then once I have what I want in there, I'll go up and sort of get to my edges. I don't do that when I put the paint down because there's just so much flowing around. So I don't know if you can see that. I'm going to take off the extra paint. But you see the way that the paint just moves around on the paper, and it makes a beautiful effect. It's kind of got a little, like a glow to it, or instead of painting a shadow all gray, this has some interest to it. I'm going to go up here and do this mango. It's a little bit bigger shape, so you might be able to see a little bit more. Okay. So I see some cool on this side, and I'm just going to deliver a lot of paint to this.
Are we not going to be in the room? And his camera is on the ceiling.
So what an underpainting does besides give interest to the things that you're painting and give a really nice effect is because I'm putting these colors all throughout the painting, what happens is that there's what you call unity to the piece because all of these things are appearing all the way around. And so as I get further in the piece, I don't have to worry so much about things sort of going together because the underpainting is consistent throughout. The other thing it does is it sort of gets me going in terms of value. So even though these things don't look realistic yet, they do have some dimension to them. Like I think this is already looking round to me. And it's obviously it's not the right colors, but to me it already has some dimension. And I'll just do a couple of grapes so you can see a little bit further what I mean. But there's enough paint to move around, and I just tilt the paper up, and I'm going to just fix my edges again while it's still wet. Okay. Sometimes I end up with too much paint, and I have to pick it up. So the paint is like, if the paper is wet, and it doesn't have to be wet, it can be damp, and there's water in your brush, the water always tries to equalize. So if this is damp and this is wet, the paint's going to go this way. If this is wet and this is dry, I can pick up paint. So you're always kind of thinking about which way you want it to go, how you want to control it. It's almost like playing an instrument to make it do what you want to do. So I'm going to stop here. Let's do one more of these. I've got it upside down, so I'm going to turn this upside down. I took a workshop once from a very famous painter from Australia, and he wrote a book about watercolor painting, and he described the way you control the paint sort of like a clock. He said there are 3 conditions of the paper. There's wet, there's dry, and then there's damp. And then he described the different consistencies of the paint. There's obviously very wet, so it's almost like tea. Like if you were to tip your palette, it would rush. Then there's sort of like coffee, which is not the color of coffee, but the consistency of coffee. And then there's cream, which is thicker. And he goes up a little bit. There's a little bit too many of them for me, but he gets all the way to toothpaste, which is basically tube paint. And you're basically, when I say it's like an instrument, any of those combinations of things are going to create different kinds of effects with the paint and the paper. So that's sort of what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about how wet the paper is, how wet my brush is. So can you see how this has some dimension already? I mean, it doesn't look realistic, but it does look round. So I'm getting a head start with sort of value and figuring out how to make things look roundish. Yes?
You put down Frisket first, right?
Oh, I did, yes. So that's a good point. I should have talked about that before. I don't know if, could you see the stuff that's on the paper? So this is, it's something called Frisket, and with watercolor, most of you probably know this, but your whites are the white of the paper. So if you're going to paint a picket fence, you would be painting around it. And there are certain shapes in here that are very, very tiny that I'm afraid that I won't be able to save, or as I get painting, I'm going to forget about, or they're too small to go around, or in the case of the orange, I want to paint this as one whole thing. I don't want to be going around these little dots here. So you put down this Frisket. It's kind of like rubber cement, and it protects your whites, and then when you're done with the painting, you remove it, and your white is there. So it's a good and bad thing. Do you use it? It's sort of like a love-hate relationship with it, because it's really great, but it's got its challenges too. So larger shapes that are white, I try not to use Frisket, because you know how the edge comes out a little bit.
And don't leave it on too long.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, and don't use a bottle that's very old either. It gets old. The best way to store it is in a dark place. And I've also been told that if there's less air in the bottle, it stays longer. So I've had people tell me they put rocks in it as they use it to keep it from. It's an interesting thing. You peel it off at the end. Yeah, you don't use your hands. You try not to use your hands too much on the paper, because the oil of your hands can affect the paper, and then you can get marks on your paper where the paint will seep in a little bit differently than it would without the fingerprints. So this is a very dirty, it's called a rubber cement pickup, and you rub it on there, and it takes it right off. So I'm going to show you some paintings in stages so you can see what I mean about removing the Frisket, but I did some work ahead of time. This is like a cooking show.
Marla, Sharon also, there was a question online. Did you say that the paper can be dry when paint is applied?
Yes, it can be dry, can be wet. I'm putting these on wet because I want this to mingle and merge and have this really pretty effect. You can see all of this here, but I did this obviously at another time, and the reason I did this is because I wanted it to be totally dry. You know, if I try to go into this, it's going to mess it up, and this has to dry probably overnight, or at least for several hours. So this is sort of how I start the painting. So you can see what I was doing here is here. I've dropped these paints in here, and I've let them blend on the paper. I have some dimension to some of the things that I have going on here. I wanted to have this done so that now I can put what I'm talking about as local color over this, so you can see what happens and that everything can be seen through it. And you know, a lot of this is really pretty, so I want it to be seen through it. So I have several stages to the way I paint. I do my primaries like this. Then I do what I call local colors. So in the case of the mango, it's, you know, orange, and there's some green in there. And then after I get all of that done, I go through a process of checking my values, because very infrequently do I get to the first layer where it's as dark as I want it to be in certain places. And the other reason why you check your values later on is the white of the paper is very distracting, and everything on the painting is relative. So when you start on white paper, you think that you're getting dark enough, and then as you start putting more paint down, somebody's shaking his head because he knows what I'm talking about, and the white starts to get covered, you start to realize, gee, that that wasn't dark enough. I thought it was dark enough, but it's not dark enough. The other issue that you're fighting is watercolors dry lighter than when you put them on, and you always have to remember that. So you've got a couple of things going against you. You have the white of the paper, you have the fact that it dries a little bit lighter, and so hence the different stages, the underpainting, the local color, and then once a lot of the white goes away, then I can get a better sense of what needs to be darker and what's the right value. So I'm going to go over here and try to go over this mango so you can see what happens with, you know, going from something that looks artificial to something that's starting to look a little bit more realistic. So we can mix up some paint. What's happening? So again, now this is totally dry, so I can put water right over it. That one not so much because that will pick up the paint or create all kinds of issues like blooms and things that you don't want to happen. I do, as I get further along in a painting, I do start putting some stuff wet on dry. But right now I want to have this mingling of colors, and the way that happens is with the paper being wet. This is I don't know if you can see, but this is a little bit different kind of a palette. They're hard to find now, where they close and the paint stays very moist and wet, whereas other palettes, the wells are open and the paint's dry. Get that clean.
Excuse me? So now you're using other colors other than the primary color.
Right. Now I'm looking at the color of the object itself.
Are they still transparent?
Most of the paints that I use are transparent. I don't use any kind of cadmiums, or I know there are artists who do that very successfully. It's just not what I do. I like the transparent colors. Some of the colors that I use are staining, but they're still transparent. I used to think that those were mutually exclusive, transparent and staining, but it's not. So do you see how that's gone from looking kind of strange with the blue and the to looking more realistic? And this is going to dry lighter. Being very finicky about my edges. It's going to dry lighter, and if I put it in the background, it's going to look a lot lighter, but for the meantime, that's as far as I'm going to go. Because I try to bring everything up sort of together at the same stage. I try not to. When I first started painting, I would paint like here, and it would grow. This was done, and then this was done, and then it was like an amoeba. It would start to, you know. But the advantage of bringing it all up at the same time is, you know, if this is finished and then this is not, you can't make adjustments as you're going along with the whole painting. So I try to bring it up all at the same time. I'm going to do a couple of these grapes, and then I'm going to walk you through, maybe we'll do that too. I'll walk you through a painting that I have. It's actually the one on the red chair. Sometimes I'll photograph things in process, in stages. So you'll be able to sort of see on something a little bit more complicated how it takes shape. I'm gonna end up with paint on my face at some point. That's what happens. So I'm putting water down. Obviously, the smaller spaces are easier to deal with.
Marla, you don't care that your water isn't perfectly clean then when you're putting it down?
There's supposed to be something going on here. This is supposed to be dirty, and that's supposed to be clean. But then I start getting into it, and I just, you know, then I'll go and I'll change my water every once in a while because I don't do what I'm supposed to be doing. But that's the theory. The theory is one is clean and one is dirty. There's a hair running through that. And my hair. So I would go around this whole thing. Let's just do the orange and see what happens to that when we. And then we're going to go look at a painting in stages. So you remember what I was talking about, the water going which way? I'm drying my brush and I'm sucking up paint here. Because there was like a little sort of river at the bottom of here. So with a dry brush, I can pick that up. And I can also, you know, sort of make things lighter. Okay. One of the things that I see people do, students in class, is that if you want the paint to merge on the paper like that, you have to keep going back and actually deliver a lot of paint to the area. And you saw me pick up paint. It's almost like you need to deliver more paint than you need. Otherwise, it only travels so far, and then it doesn't merge with the other colors. It just sort of sits. So you see how that purple's already turned to look more like it belongs on the orange now? And if I want to get lighter, I just dip my brush in the water. I still sort of have pigment on my brush, just less of it. So I'm trying to get lighter as I go. This orange, and I can do that again. There's still pigment on here, but just less. It's kind of like adding water to your puddle, but I'm just doing it with my brush. Okay, so you see how that changed really quickly? So it's a very interesting process. It goes from looking sort of like Madras pants to, in a very short period of time, into something that looks a little bit more realistic. I don't know what I would do with those shadows, but I probably, if I were leaving this white or off-white or something, I probably would, first of all, I'd want to get them darker, because you can see that the value is, see how different that is? I don't know, can you see? I probably would go over it with some kind of a neutral gray or some kind of transparent gray, but all of this would still show through, even once I've done that. Or if I have a pattern going through it, it will get darker where the pattern runs through the shadow area. It will be darker pattern than it would be where it's in the light area. Okay, so can I show that? So that painting over there, the far one on the red chair, I want to show you that in stages, and it's sort of just what we've done here. So this is my drawing. You can see it's pretty detailed. I get very detailed with my drawing. Go back. Where did it go? And you can see it. These are the areas we were talking about, the mask or the frisket. Those are highlights on the fruit. Okay. So here I'm doing the same thing that I did here. I'm putting some where I see there's a reflective glow, and this is a cooler area of what will be a red pear, and I've done the same thing with the shadows here. You can see the different colors that I've dropped in there so that they're not just a boring splotch of color, but there's something going in there with some reflected light. You can go to the next one. So I'm doing the same thing there. It looks very busy. It's all the same stuff, though. It's all the blue, reds, and the yellows. So, I have some dimension to the plate. I have some roundness to the fruit. It doesn't look realistic because the colors aren't right, but I've given myself sort of a head start. I have some curvature to the cloth. You can see some of the cloth turning. Okay. And it's just the same thing in here. I've done a little bit of the inside of the fruit. So now I don't really have to pay attention to where the pattern is darker and where it's lighter, because I've already done the work underneath. So it's darker in the shadow, it's darker here in the shadow. I don't have to really be paying a lot of attention to that. Okay. So now this is one layer, just like I did here. So I've gone from, I put some green over this one, some yellow over this one, some red over that one. I've continued to work through the pattern. Okay? What changed there? The pattern? Sometimes I don't know what's different. Okay, so just, I think what I'm doing here now is, could you go back one again? There might be. No, you can keep going. Forward. I'm trying to see if I've changed any value. Is that the last one? I think we're missing a couple. Oh, maybe that's it. Oh, that's another piece. Anyway, between some of those, I've gone back and decided this needs to be darker in the shadow area. This needs to be darker here. I've removed my Frisket and I've softened my edges of the fruit, and probably just gotten darker in a bunch of places. So it's the underpainting, it's the layering over with local color, and then it's looking at the value of things and making sure that the values of the things are relative to one another the way I want them to be. So that's this piece, and if you get a chance afterwards to look at it, you'll see some things shining through. There's definitely yellows in here, and this is definitely cooler red here, which was blue, and same thing going on here that I was doing over there, and then I just went crazy with the background on that. So I don't know if anybody has any questions, but that's sort of my process.
So I'm curious how that plate has the white spaces, and the apple looked like it wasn't quite, it was sort of yellowish, and at the end it's white. How did that happen?
This one here,
Yeah.
it could have been that I took the picture when it was wet, and remember I said it dries lighter.
Okay, and the plate,
Um,
I assume it's a plate.
yeah.
Whatever. You had stuff all around it, and it ended up white.
Well, that's because when everything gets dark, then the lights become lighter. So that's what I talk about when you're trying to adjust your values. It's very misleading in the beginning, and there's been paintings where I've thought. I remember this painting I did of a street scene in Quebec, and there was yellow molding, and it was a stone building, and I put in some shadows on the yellow, and there was a lot of white paper, and I thought, oh, I lost all the light. All the light is gone. It's just, I was very upset about it. And then as I started to paint more and I got my darks in, all of a sudden the light came back. So everything is relative. If you want to paint light, you have to paint darks. And I think some people, that's a little counterintuitive to people, but to get light, you need to have darks. And that's why that plate probably looked duller. And then when things went around it, it starts to look very bright. It's a very interesting process. I did a painting once where I decided I'm going to get really dark really fast. And I put the shadow down on the page, and it was so dark. I thought, it was the first thing I did. This is like ruined. But it's next to this white of this paper. And I just kept painting it. It was like an exercise to just figure it out. And, once I was done, it didn't need to be adjusted. It was fine. And it was a piece that won me an award, you have to have, it takes a lot of patience. You have to have a vision of where it's going. You have to know what's going to happen. You have to talk yourself off a ledge sometimes where I said, like, oh my God, the light is gone, and I have to remind myself, okay, I don't have my darks in yet. I got to stay patient. I have to, not jump out the window. And, I've done it enough now that I can talk to myself like that. But it's, when you put something down on the paper, everything else changes. You put one thing down on paper, everything changes, because everything is relative. I don't know if anybody has any other questions. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how you select your subject? This is terrific, but somewhere along the way you decided that was the right arrangement.
Yeah, I take a lot of pictures of the same thing from different angles. I'll start by saying everything that I photograph is done with natural light, not artificial light. So it's usually sunlight. It's by a window. It's outside on my porch. It's just not the same when you have indoor light and outdoor light. I'll set something up and I'll move things around and I'll take 150 pictures. Not, I'm exaggerating, but a lot of pictures. And more often than not, even though I have so many, there's always something wrong with the composition. There's always something that needs to be changed. Even though I've set it up, I'll find something that's not working. So it doesn't end up looking exactly like the photo I choose, but that's how I get there. I take my photos either late in the day or early in the morning, and that's why the shadows are long and not short. So, you see these shadows are really long. So it's either morning or late afternoon. When you go outside in the end of the day, when it's sunny out, it's such a beautiful sight, the long shadow. It's just much more interesting than the shadows that are just like around you. And so that's usually what I do when I'm setting them up. It's either early morning or late afternoon. There are some pieces, I haven't brought everything. I mostly brought still lifes, but there are some pieces that are just scenes that I've come upon, and I will take photos of that and I'll paint those. Again, often the composition is not quite right. Something's got to be changed. Something's in the wrong place, or things are touching the wrong way, or I think you very infrequently get a perfect composition, but yeah.
Do you still use the same technique when you're doing landscapes?
It's a very good question. I try to do it as much as I can, and what that means is it's easier to do where you have large shapes, and sometimes when you're doing compositions that are landscape, there's a lot of little shapes where it doesn't really make sense to put the paint in and let it flow because they're just very tiny little shapes. But there's usually something in the painting that will allow me to do that. I did a tree. I have some paintings. I didn't give you all of them, but I have a tree on my iPad I can show you later that I painted in Nantucket. And there's a lot of little shadows from the leaves and a lot of little leaves casting the shadows and a lot of little flowers in the flower boxes. But the tree was big. And the tree was red and blue before I put the brown on it. And you can see on that tree there's a warm side and there's a cool side to the tree. It looks very cool. It came out really nice. So I try to find places where I can do that. But that's a good question because it requires some real estate. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. Sure. So that's a painting I recently did. So, you can see here, there's a glow here. This is definitely cooler over here. You can see that this is cool here. It's warmer in there. And if you've seen the process, you can go and look at some of these things and realize, what was done. But, that was painted in layers, just like this. It's just a different kind of subject matter. Is there another one? So this was an interesting piece because these little shapes, you can't do that underpainting with. Glass is a whole bunch of little shapes. Glass is nothing. It's just a bunch of refracted little shapes, and you look at the shapes and they look like nothing to you when you're painting them, and then you put it away and you come back the next day and it looks like glass. It's like the fairy came and waved the wand. But like these areas, and under here, I definitely did some underpainting. So I just find some areas to do it. I think there's one more. So if you look carefully at this, you can see the cool and the warm and in the laces. What I was trying to do with this painting was lose edges. There's different ways to create mood in a piece, and some of it has to do with value, and some of it has to do with edges. And when you get like some soft edges and some lost edges, it creates a different kind of mood than when everything is crisp and hard. So that's sort of, there's a lot of softness in the background. That gives it a different mood than if I had a sharp line for the table, where you could see where the table ended. This has got a much different kind of mood to it than keeping everything completely crystal clear. And the same thing with the shadow. It just gives it a different kind of feel.
In that teacup picture, did you use any Frisket or is that all?
I used Frisket on the string because I wanted to paint right through there. I didn't want to have to paint around. I wanted to paint the surface as one surface without having to sneak around the string. I think I put Frisket on this very small rim and this rim. And I have a tool that I used to put the Frisket on that was something somebody showed me a while back. I don't know I'm losing my microphone. If anybody who paints has ever seen this, but it's called a ruling pen. A lot of times beforehand, people use brushes to put Frisket on. I don't know what you guys use, but it ruins your brush because it's, it dries like a rubber, and it's hard to control with the brush too. And this is called a ruling pen. It's actually used for drawing pen and ink, I think. You can adjust how thin it is or open it to make it wider. And I just want to show you something real fast. And I can control this really well. So this is the Frisket. I pick it up. You see that line? It's really nice. So when I say I did that little rim around the teacup, the only thing you have to be careful about is when you're not pushing on the paper real hard because you'll disturb the fibers of the paper, so you're doing it very lightly. I've made that mistake, and then when I take it off, the paper is not pristine anymore. But yeah.
It's metal, so
It's not. You're not ruining a brush, and you get a much finer edge to it than you would with a brush. So that's a good trick. Are there any other questions?
What's a Frisket? I don't even know what that is.
Frisket? It's kind of like a latex, and it goes on wet, dries, and it's like it's almost like rubber cement, and you paint right over it, and then when you're done, you lift it, and your whites are saved. Yeah. No.
you tell we've never done it.
Yeah. Well, the white is your paper.
Yeah.
It's the opposite of like oil, where you put your white on. So those little tiny little lines and things are hard to save sometimes. So you use this. Yeah.
So I saw that you do teach a class
Yeah.
as well.
Yes.
During the class, you typically would give a little direction and then you would work.
So I've taught two different kinds of classes, and I've given some workshops, and some of them we work on the same thing together, and so you get to go through the whole process along with me, so we work on the same reference. And then I've had other classes where people bring in what they want to bring in, and they see what I'm working on, and I talk about what I'm working on, and I give some demonstrations of what I'm working on and I go around and help people with what they're particularly doing, which is a good way to do it also because everybody gets to learn from everybody else's piece, and so you get a lot of different situations that come up as opposed to just working on one piece. But they're both good ways to do it.
When and how do you sign up for the classes? I looked on your website. And I couldn't-
Well, the last 2 years there haven't been
I
very
haven't-
many
I
classes.
saw that, yeah.
Yeah. So I really haven't started up again. During COVID, I did a couple of very small Zoom classes because I wanted to see if I could do it and how that would work out. And then now it's nice out. I don't usually teach in the summer or the nice weather. I'm busy doing other stuff. I don't like to be inside. So usually when like the late fall rolls around and the winter, that's usually when I'm doing my teaching. And I'll either be doing workshops. I've done workshops at Wayland, Arts Wayland. Sometimes I rent space at a church and do a weekly class. So those things are usually posted on my Facebook page or my website, but there hasn't been any. So.
You should try the Weston Innovation Center.
You know what? I used to teach at the Weston Community Center and had a fairly large space there, so that was nice. But then that closed, and I haven't been back there since. And I have talked to the lady who does the, yeah, I haven't been in there.
Yeah, it's really
I saw it before they redid it.
Me too, yeah.
Any other?
Do you have pictures of your landscape painting?
I have some. I'll show you that tree thing that I was talking about. If I can get this open. This is very challenging. Okay. Where are my photos here? So this was the tree. This was blue.
Oh, wow.
This was red. So you can see. So there wasn't a lot of place to do the underpainting, but
You probably did in the shadows over there.
yeah,
didn't you?
yep. And a little bit down here in these shadows, but this was the one where I thought I lost the light because I just had done the yellows and nothing else. The darks weren't in, and I thought that was gone. Yeah, that's the one. I think that's Montreal or Quebec. It's one of those. Here's another one. That's also Nantucket. So that shadow went on. And the shadow went on in one piece, and then the door went in, and then the molding went in, and then so I had the door dark where it needed to be dark already. I didn't have to paint the door and the shadows and then line them up with what was on the molding. I just go through and do that whole thing once. I was looking for something in particular. Well, here's another one. Nope, that's not working. Hold on. I'm trying to get it so it's... I go back and forth between... When I teach, I do a lot of still life. Does that look familiar?
That looks very familiar.
Did you pen those?
Yeah.
How do you make a door?
The-
Did you sketch first?
Oh, I sketch. There's a lot of sketching. There's a lot of pencil on it, and sometimes the pencil is still there afterwards. And people, sometimes students will ask me like, "Well, there's pencil on there." This was an interesting painting. So this was all painted with all those colors, and then you can see that there's warm and cool areas, and all the pavement was painted that way. This It's painted that way underneath. And you can kind of see it's warmer and cooler on the edges. So it's really fun.
How much time do you paint, like, per day, or
You know what? It
or how do
goes
you work? I don't know.
it goes in fits and starts. If I'm into something and I'm working really, I usually paint at one or two things at a time. I don't paint any more than that. I don't. I'm usually working on one thing, and it just depends. If I'm really into it, I'm doing it a lot, and then it, it's a momentum thing. When you're done with a painting, then you have to come up with an idea. You have to sketch it. You have to prep it, and it's like pushing a rock. You have to get it going, and so sometimes there's some resistance to that. So it goes up and down and up and down. I don't think there's any way I can answer that routinely.
But when you're doing one, say one at a time,
Yeah,
you get to a certain point, you now have to wait for it.
I have to wait.
So you,
Sometimes I have two things going because you're right. I have to wait for things to dry, and there are certain times where something's touching something, something's touching everything. So everything's I can't go to that because that's wet, and I can't do this shape because that's wet. And so you have to put it aside, and you have to let it dry. Sometimes you have to let it dry overnight because you saw me put water back on that mango, and if that was wet, it would mess up what was there or if it would lift it. So it has to be totally like bone dry. Yeah. So sometimes if I'm teaching, I'll use a hair dryer, but I prefer to let things dry. I don't know why. I don't know if the dryer does anything. It probably doesn't, but that's right. Makes a lot of noise in class. But, yeah. So.
Did you take a lot of lessons to get to where you are?
So I worked 15 years in the investment business. I didn't go to art school. I started painting watercolors towards the end of my career, and I really liked it. I always did something as a kid. I was always, sketching and doodling and, did oil, tried this, tried that. And when I tried watercolor, I just felt like this was what I was looking for. When I stopped working, I found an artist. He was at that point in Chelmsford. He was fabulous teacher, and I used to drive up to Chelmsford weekly for like a 2.5, 3 hour class every week, and he really pushed me. I had taken from some other people at night and here and there, and I took from him for a number of years. And then after that, I'll take workshops from people. And I'll still do that sometimes. But a number of years ago, I decided I would try teaching. And you learn a lot from teaching. I thought maybe, maybe this is not a good idea because I'm going to stop learning. But you learn, when you have to articulate things out loud, what's going on in your head, and it becomes very, very clear. So you learn a lot. Yeah.
can you combine color and sketches, the final product? Or after color, you need some shadow, can you use a pencil?
Some people do. There are watercolor pencils. Some people use colored mixed medium. My stuff is just watercolors. I don't.
So when you do sketches first, then you
Oh,
make
first,
sketches and then put color on?
like a value sketch. No, I usually go right to the painting. Yeah.
Well, when I asked you about the buildings and
Yeah.
windows and doors,
Yeah.
you do sketches first.
I
No.
no. I usually take a lot of pictures, and those are sort of my sketches, and then I sort of make a value sketch out of my pictures on the computer.
How do you make it so precise? The door frame and
A lot of practice. A lot of practice. But I draw. If I'm doing something architectural, when I draw it, I'm using a straight edge somewhere. I don't draw that freehand. I use a straight edge to put, like a ruler or a triangle or something to put the straight edge down. So And then when I get to paint, I have the straight edge to follow, and then you just have to have a steady hand. The other thing about watercolor is that's different about oil and stuff is that you can't erase and you can't paint over, really. So, but what I wanted to say is there are ways to make corrections that people don't think can happen, but it can. A long time ago, when I first started painting, I painted a very intricate silver. It was a silver set. It was a teacup, and it was a whole set. It had a pitcher, and it was all silver. So it was like that glass thing with a bunch of little shapes and stuff like that. And it was very intricate. It took a lot of time, and I painted it. It came out nice, and then I painted the background, and I hated it. After doing all that work, I just hated it. It was horrible. So this is very, very heavy paper, 300-pound paper. So I sort of taped off the stuff I had painted, and I went into the basement and I got my husband's orbital sander, and I sanded the paper down back to white, and I repainted the background, and I sold the painting. But that's an extreme example of making I never did that again. But there are ways to correct things. There are ways to lift. It's much less forgiving than some other things, but there's ways to get around it. A lot of times it has to do with changing values and getting things darker to make things brighter.
Can I ask a question about how to make a vase
Mm-hmm.
light like it is round?
So you have to determine where your light source is coming from. Yep. So it would.
One here would be out.
Right. Most often, what's not done enough is it's not dark enough in the dark areas, and that's what makes it round. It's this value change. Okay, you're welcome. Thank you all.